folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with another episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have another, we have Darius on again.
Hey.
Darius, how's it going, man?
Yeah, doing great.
This is two in a row for us, I think, for the
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah. Finally getting back into the swing of things. So I'm really glad to be back.
Yeah. So this episode is going to be all about the XZ Backdoor. And I thought, Darius and I were thinking we would hop on the podcast and kind of talk about it from our perspective. We're not going to necessarily get into like the specific nitty gritty of like, hey, these are the versions, this is what you got to do. This is more going to be commentary around the event, the implications of it. We were talking a little bit about, Kubernetes and clusters and what it means for open source, what the potential fallout is and kind of the long-term ramifications of this, the long tail of this. So this will be kind of analysis, kind of a commentary and discussion around XZ itself and kind of what we think, how things went down at a high level, and our thoughts around it. So as a brief overview, I wanted to share a couple tweets just to kind of set the stage for the discussion. So for those of you listening on the podcast, I'm going to share my screen and put up a couple tweets here. And let's see here. We can zoom in. Does that look all right?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Or does this look better? I think I like that better.
Yeah.
So this was a tweet. Lots of analysis around XZ. Most skip over the first step of the attack. The original maintainer burns out, and only attacker offers to help. So he inherits the trust of the project. He starts with a reasonable request, right? That, is this still being maintained? And this thread kind of goes through a high-level summary of kind of the events that transpired. I've got another tweet kind of related to this that I want to talk through as well. But Darius, just your thoughts maybe on these first couple tweets of like maintainer burnout, open source, like how difficult it is to kind of maintain an open source project, contribute to it, and kind of keep stuff like this alive,
Yeah, so I think this is where you kind of get into the open source, closed source debate, right? So, this has been going on for years. It's nothing new, but, for so long, kind of the push and the narrative for a lot of people have been, no, like open source is the way to go. It's community driven, and it should be more secure because more eyes are going to be on it, right? But what we're seeing more and more, especially with a lot of these, supply chain attacks and things of that nature, is open source is only good and secure when the community is actually putting eyes on it. And in most cases, that's not happening, right? In most cases, it's just a Google search or it's already prepackaged and you're not going to question it because you're assuming others have looked at it, right? And so, you see it all the time where you have, open source solutions that are, become ingrained in other services and solutions and things of that nature. And at some point the developer stops. Like it can be tough to constantly maintain software that a lot of people use for free, right? And so, what we saw here is just kind of the perfect storm of that, which is kind of unfortunate, right? Because a lot of times we tell people like, hey, you contribute to open source projects, right? But what do you do when it gets hijacked?
Yeah, and like you were hitting on there's a lot of misconceptions that open source is more secure, right? And this is one of those examples of, and somebody else tweeted this, and I forget who mentioned it, so I apologize for not attributing it to you, but somebody had mentioned on Twitter that if you maintain an open source project that kind of runs the world, that's no longer a hobby. Right?
Yeah.
If it's a critical third-party component to like the Linux operating system or Unix, or if it's a necessary thing that people are relying on now to be safe, to be maintained, to be updated, that gets to the point where it's no longer a hobby, and those projects should be supported, right? Like there should be support for those people. There should be help maintaining those, helping make sure that they're secure, that they're updated. That would be really nice if there was some way to ensure that because, if you're a one-man show and you have people beating on your door for bug fixes and features and stuff like that, it's not easy, and it can be very frustrating to not have support for those things, especially when people are relying on them so heavily. And this is a good example of that.
For sure. And in an ideal world, I think you would have that just by the nature of open source projects. But I think kind of just in reality, it's tough, right? There are, a countless numbers of projects and things out there. And in an ideal world, that's where the community would come in to
Yep.
contribute. But I think there's a combination of things. One, most people are interested in. I think part of it is, we as professionals need to do a better job of giving back and contributing to the community, right? Like, imagine if this was more of a tool that, more and more people were involved with, right? You probably reduce the chances of this happening.
Yep.
But on top of it, I think part of it is also, you kind of have the skill set divide as well. When you start getting into these like low level code, that's a skill set that a lot of people lack. And so,
Yep.
it's really hard to, get the community's eyes on it and trust that, hey, this package, nothing nefarious is going on.
Yep. Yeah, especially for these kind of obscure libraries that most people have never heard of. I, have never heard of XZ, this Java XZ utils before this happened, right? I had
Likewise.
no idea this compression library existed. And I'm sure a lot of people are the same way with a lot of other things, right? There's tons of open source, projects and libraries that are being used in commercial applications that people have never heard of before that are being maintained, by a few people, by a small group. So there's a lot of examples of that.
But can we talk about just how patient, and granted, I know all this is still currently like speculation, right?
Yep.
But how patient the threat actor was in this case. I mean, you're talking about really building up
Yep.
trust
Yep.
among the community, right?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about too. And I have another tweet from Thaddeus Grug on Twitter that kind of talks about it. But for those that aren't aware, kind of the implication here, kind of the idea of what happened or what transpired was there's this maintainer of this project, right? The owner of the project, the guy who started it and kind of was the core maintainer. He's kind of burnt out, right? And he's got issues and stuff to fix and a whole bunch of stuff going on, right? Well, there's this, and I think they call them, I don't know if it's in this tweet or the other one, but they call them like the angry customer, right? Where there's somebody like banging on the door, like, hey, I need these fixes. Like, there's stuff broken. I need you to fix it. And the maintainer is like, he's struggling to keep up, right? Like this tweet says. And he's got, bug fixes and features to develop. And he mentions this Giatan person who's, has helped him in the past and he's helped contribute to the project. And, he might have a bigger role in the future, right? And it's clear my resources are limited. So here comes this threat actor potentially, right? This Giatan person who's like, yeah, I can help with that. And the kind of the implication here, if I'm reading between the lines, is that this angry customer who is kind of like, hey, all these issues, I need them fixed, and this Giatan person, we're kind of in on this together, this operation, potentially from an intelligence organization, kind of set up this event where Giatan eventually gets like contributor rights to the repo, and then eventually gets the power to kind of push those commits and make those PRs and stuff to get this stuff pushed into the project. So that's kind of a high level. So I'd love to get your thoughts, Darius, on kind of the operation aspect of it. Like you mentioned, patience. Like this is a couple year thing that was going on for the Giatan person to get trust, to contribute to the library, to gain that trust with the core maintainer, and then to be in a position to like get those rights to be able to publish to the repo and stuff like that. So very interesting series of events.
Yeah, so man, there's a lot of layers to this. I guess kind of the first one I kind of think of is like, man, just like, so once again, the patience,
Hmm.
the patience, and you built trust, and I think that also kind of leads into we talk about skill sets, right?
Yep.
So you have this individual who does have the skill sets because prior to this they're actually contributing and helping out, so the skill set is there. Um,
Yep.
but it's just in this case, it was unfortunate that this person wasn't as trustworthy as the maintainer initially thought.
Yep.
But I think that kind of also leads to, once again, I just kind of think of the community at large, right? When you're using open source solutions, there is no contract or obligation that the maintainer is going to do anything. And
Yep.
so I think we have to kind of get out of this notion of like I get from the maintainer, he's feeling the pressure a little bit. You don't owe
Yep.
anybody anything. It's open source.
Yep.
You can always, if you really want to, fork it, fix it yourself,
Yep.
right? So I think we have to kind of get out of this idea that when it's open source, it is community driven. And so the reality of the matter is, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to be patient. It may never get fixed, or the features you need may never get added, and you have to be okay with that. And if not, go to a paid closed source solution,
Yep.
right? But I just think we as a community have to we've become so reliant on open source
Yep.
solutions, which can be a good thing, but we also have to hedge our expectations as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of commercial software using open source libraries, right? And those
That's
commercial
fair.
softwares could also contribute back to those projects financially to support the maintainers or
Hmm.
resources and help developing or issuing bug fixes and stuff like that. And that very may well be happening, right, on some levels. But it's kind of it can be kind of get difficult to get that support sometimes for a small project that's seemingly insignificant, or it looks like it on paper, right? But this is another tweet that was interesting, kind of more from like the threat intel side of things. This person says it was predominantly a human intelligence style operation, and they kind of go through what that kind of looks like, and they talk about this from an intelligence like operation standpoint, which I thought was very interesting because I'm into this kind of intelligence side of things. I think that's a very interesting perspective for people who are very knowledgeable about this type of stuff, of how this stuff happens and what are some of the precursors and what some of the, I guess, red flags could have been early on, with detecting this. And the interesting thing to me too about this, right, is, and we haven't got there yet, but this was found on accident,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
For those who aren't super
Hmm.
familiar with what happened, a developer at Microsoft noticed a little bit of lag, right? It was like the basic idea. He noticed some failed logins with SSH, but he started digging into it and noticed that there was some latency issues, I think is what the core thing happened was.
Yep.
And then he started digging into it and it was like, okay, this doesn't look right. And then he raised the flag on it. So this was, and there's an interesting tweet here.
This
I'll
could have
see
been
if I can
bad.
find it.
This could have been so bad.
Um, so this is the tweet I wanted to highlight is the way the campaign is falling apart under scrutiny is to be expected. They did not build a campaign to resist investigation. They built a campaign to avoid investigation, and they were successful. At no point in the campaign did they raise suspicion. It was just their bad luck. Like,
Yeah.
that to me speaks to the operation of like what they were trying to accomplish. Like they weren't trying to necessarily obfuscate the thing itself. They were obfuscating like the campaign, and they were very successful in how they carried out this campaign, such that you needed somebody in place that had the skills to code Java in this library, right? You needed the people to know how to do that, or at least some people on the team to do that. And then you needed that angry customer, angry consumer, right?
Yeah.
So a
And I
lot of
mean,
things transpired here.
for sure. And it's tough, right? Because I mean, it follows the typical, phishing or like human kind of targeting playbook, right? Sense of urgency,
Yep.
in this case, they offered up a solution. So, I mean, honestly, brilliant campaign, like objectively, right?
Yep.
Um, I'll also say that, I mean, let's to be realistic, it was a highly sophisticated attack too. I mean, imagine the work that was put in. I
Yeah.
mean, you take into the fact that it wasn't the payload and malicious code wasn't exactly a part of the source code, right? You factor in the
Yep.
fact that it can only work when provided with the attacker private key, right? So it's
Yep.
really cool in terms of like, yeah, if the attacker private key wasn't given, then
Yep.
everything runs as normal. Like that right there is, it's in my
Yep.
opinion highly sophisticated. Um, and to the point of like, man, imagine doing all of that work, right? This technically should have gone off without a hitch, which
Yep.
imagine the fallout of that, right? Like if
Yep.
this had gone on and to like future versions, right? That's terrifying. But all of that hard work, but you didn't handle your utilization and your memory properly.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if that developer, Andreas, I forget his full name, if he didn't
Um,
spot it, right? Like, let's say even he didn't notice anything, right?
yeah,
Would it be noticed? Would it ever be
yeah,
noticed? So we can speculate and theorize. How long would it have been there until somebody noticed? Maybe something happens in the future and it pops up again. But also it makes you wonder what the long-term goal is, like what the long tail of this is. What was there an end target in mind? Was it purely just to kind of infiltrate and do reconnaissance on a number of organizations specifically, that are known to use, Linux operating systems or places where this utility would be used. It's very interesting to think about what the end game is for this, if there was one at all.
So I could definitely we can put on our conspiracy theorist hats for a little bit, right? I mean, so like to your point, right? That's this right there. This is a library and a package that is like installed in by default on like a lot of Linux distros, right?
Yeah.
That's just crazy. A backdoor into pretty much like, let's say this goes on for months or even years unnoticed, right? So multiple versions, it's now ingrained, right?
Yep.
It's pushed out to you know Linux servers everywhere.
Yep.
um a backdoor into pretty much any Linux system, that's huge. And so, I mean, I think part of it is like, okay, the threat actors involved,
Yep.
who are they? Who do they work? Is it a nation state type of deal? Is it
Yep.
just two people? Or is it just like an organization, trying to do their own thing? But either way, that is extremely,
Yep.
powerful, correct? Because this is ultimately, I read, this is ultimately like an RCE, right? So you have RCE on pretty much any Linux system, a backdoor on any Linux system. That even if you're not a nation state, imagine being just the threat actors behind it. You now can sell this to any
Yep.
nation, right? And that's
Sure.
a huge, that's a huge deal. So that's kind of where my mind and my conspiracy
Yeah, and
theories go.
and then following on that train of thought, right? This was caught seemingly out of luck,
Yeah,
right? Just by chance, because of some instability, some latency, and some lag. What are the chances that other third-party libraries,
and
have
that's the scary
similar
part. Yeah,
issues or other software? Not to be alarmist, but being pragmatic, you know, this is probably not the first time. This is definitely not the first time something like this has happened, but this is probably not going to be the last we hear of this type of thing. And the last this is, this attack kind of happens because it can be very, sneaky. No one knew anything about this library until a few days ago. Like very few people probably have
yeah,
ever heard of this library before last weekend, right? And there's
yeah.
probably other things that are very relied upon that are ingrained in cloud services, in data centers, in operating systems, and you name it. That's what kind of scares me from like a holistic perspective. Is like everything that we do doesn't matter if there's just a back door, right?
Yeah, and so I think one, supply chain attacks have and will continue to be kind of a major issue, if not, at least in my opinion, at least top three issue
Yep.
amongst cybersecurity community. I mean, we've seen it for the past 5+ years, right, of how big supply chain attacks can be.
Yep.
Um, I think it's important to, it can definitely feel kind of hopeless, right? Because like, what
Mm.
do you do? This package is just there. Um, but to kind of fall back on our kind of default and best practices, right? The reality of the matter is you can't protect against anything, everything, right?
Yep.
But if you have, security in depth, you have layers to it. You might not catch the 0 day, right? You might,
Yep.
that can be a tough thing, right? Like analysts, and a lot of times it's really easy to overlook a spike in performance, right? Because
Yep.
that takes some really in-depth, like low-level diving through things to figure that out.
Yep.
Most people disregard it, right? But if you have tight controls in other areas, you can definitely reduce at least the impact, right? Ideally.
Yeah, and I love this tweet by Swift on security that illustrates that point too. And they say, maybe I'm a spoil sport here, but someone should point out it's not your job to worry about attacks like XZ unless you're in a very precise role. And this is fun, but you should get back to disabling NTLM v1 on Monday and patching network devices. So we just spent 20 minutes talking about this very elaborate, intelligence campaign, probably from a nation state to get access to seemingly unlimited number of systems anywhere they want at any given time, anything on the internet at least. But here we are going back to the basics, right? Like a majority of people don't ever have to worry about things like this, or a majority of organizations will likely, have more significant return on investment with focusing on the basics, focusing on the fundamentals,
Yep.
hardening your network, making sure you have good endpoint security installed and good monitoring in place, making sure you have a good instant response plan and you know what to do when something happens, having good backups, that
Yep.
are isolated and not just on your network. It's those things that really matter. And they go on to say, if you get hacked because of this 0 day, because of this backdoor that no one knew about, like that's a win. If
Yeah.
if you have done everything right and the only way to compromise your organization is through this very niche, very obscure 0 day thing, like you've done everything right. Like there's almost a diminishing return on what you can do after that. And if that's what it takes, that's a tremendous amount of effort that goes into that to be able to compromise an organization through that way. So I think that's something to consider, right? Is yes, this is important. Yes, you should focus on it, make sure you're patched and make sure you're good. But there's a whole lot of other things that are going to probably hurt you a lot harder and a lot more than this backdoor that happened over the weekend.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we see this all the time on our pen test, right? You're not going to burn the custom, POC that you've developed when you can just go to a file share and search for passwords.
Yep.
You're not, so I mean,
Yep.
I 100% agree
And
with
I think
this take.
this is a good opportunity to practice some asset management and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Do you know where all your Linux devices are,
Yep.
or Mac devices?
Do you have
like
do you have a cadence for patching them, right?
Yeah.
Or are they just, out
Exactly.
there? No,
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I think something else is kind of interesting to me that we talked a little bit about it was, let's assume that this works, like this attack works, right? Or, I think a lot of time, like so far from what I've seen, as far as the discourse surrounding this has been, your servers. Something else that I think is kind of interesting is, what about containers, right? And so, I mean, like Alpine, which is a common, Linux distro that's used for containers, is also technically a version of it that is impacted by this backdoor. Or could be, right? And so, to me, I just think it's cool. Not to hijack too much, but I think it's cool the fact that, man, you literally have something to where you can get on, like forget servers, you can get onto containers and
Yep.
take it from there. I mean, if you have something spun up in the right version and everything, and the stars align, you have something spun up in like AWS, for example.
Yep.
You compromise a container, you now potentially have the ability to compromise an entire, AWS account.
Yeah.
So that to me is pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. The implications to cloud providers, stuff that's, infrastructure as a service, stuff that you would normally not have to worry about, right?
Hmm.
Because
And that's normally harder to detect. Honestly,
yeah,
I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, container
yeah,
attacks are huge right now.
yeah. And you look at the shared responsibility model, it's like, oh, that's not my problem to worry about, but now all of a sudden it is. And, you have to make sure that your vendor is making sure that these things are updated and patched. And, so yeah, it's definitely a real concern. And I think this other tweet kind of goes into some of the details of and kind of nuances of the RC itself, kind of like the backdoor itself, which are interesting. So if anybody is curious and wants to read through some of like the reverse engineering of it, this might be an interesting thread for you to follow. But like you were saying, Darius, the current kind of understanding, I guess, is that it's a remote code execution. And I think originally it was thought it was like an authentication bypass, but now this is thought to be a remote code execution. Have you looked at the details of like the payloads or anything like that? Have you looked at any of the reverse engineering stuff?
So no, and I haven't done a huge deep dive yet.
Yeah, I haven't.
I've,
I
I've,
haven't
I've pretty
looked at
much just
it.
read. I've pretty much just read like a gist.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I've just read through the tweets, but it's definitely interesting to see. Um, there was definitely work that was put into this. There was definitely some sophistication that was put into creating this and how they did it. And I think that just also illustrates the point that this was not, some accidental, threat actor thing. Like this was a well thought out campaign that was developed. It had time invested in creating this, and it was very thoughtful. It seemed like to me.
yeah, for sure.
So this is an interesting thread that links to other resources for reverse engineering the backdoor. People have created POCs for it, for the RCE. So that's out there if you want to test detection.
Which that's really cool. On a more humorous note, it's good for us, right? We can expect to see CTFs, and
Yep.
Give it a couple months, right? You'll probably see a try hack me lab on exploiting.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed John Hammond hasn't made a video on it yet. Come on, John.
I'm sure it's coming, and I'm sure it's going to be great.
Yeah. No, I love John's videos. I watched I watched from beginning to end on his Apex Legends video. I thought it was really good. So I was expecting him to make something on this, but maybe in the future.
Hey, oh, for sure. And if we get lucky, now he has kind of the new pay what you can kind of training. So I mean, hey, you never know. Maybe what's in the work with him in regards to him.
But lots of good information on this. Takeaways, Darius. Thoughts on what people should be thinking about, right? If I'm an IT manager, a CISO, security manager, security admin, something like that, at a firm, at an organization.
Yeah.
How do I respond to this? How should I think about this? Can I prepare for stuff like this in the future? What are some things that you think people like that should be thinking about in the context of this?
Okay. So, ideally you have a process and a policy in place for this already, right? But I mean, at first and foremost, it's a relatively easy fix, right? We caught it early. We caught it early as a community. Make sure that none of your stuff is on the version that is susceptible to this, right? First and foremost, it's an easy fix. Ideally, a proper asset management. Go out, check it, patch it, make sure you're not on the version. Easy. But I think beyond that, it's all the stuff we talked about. Is, are we doing the best practices? Do we have proper asset management so that we know everything? Do we have a patch cadence? And even beyond just the patch cadence, what is our what is our process for patching, right? Do you patch everything at once? Or do you, patch a few devices? Like what, how do you, making sure you have a plan and a process in place for like, hey, we really vetted this patch, right? And now we're going to push it out. Because stuff like that is how we catch supply chain attacks, right? This happened because Andres basically was doing benchmarking, right? I'm
Yep.
assuming because if I remember correctly, he was testing out a new version, doing benchmarking,
Yep.
discovered it, right? So if more people are doing that type of stuff, we have a better chance of catching things like this. So I think it starts with that patch management, and then ultimately making sure that you're hardening your systems where you and your processes where you can. So do you have an EDR solution on every single box, right? You run into this all the time on pen tests where they may have it in 80% of the places, right? Do the last 20, make sure EDR is installed, and find that balance so that it doesn't impact your business, right? Um, Making sure that you don't have clear text passwords just out in the open, disabling NTL NV1, right? All that, there's other stuff you can do, right? Like if you're doing those things in conjunction with proper patch management and staying kind of abreast of what's happening in the community, you'll put yourself in a really good spot.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to echo that last point of keeping up to date with things that are happening. A lot of times people will ask, in kickoff calls, during pen tests, when we're having conversations with clients, how do you stay up to date with what's happening? Like, how do you get threat intel? Like, how do you get news on what's happening, and how do you know about stuff that's going on that is important and that we should know about from a security perspective? And my number one resource is I tell people to get an account and go on X or Twitter, right?
Yeah.
All of this news broke on Twitter. There was resources in other places, but the conversations were on Twitter, right? Predominantly, the conversations started and happened on Twitter, and people were sharing most of the information on Twitter on X. So Twitter and X is a great place for up-to-date, like relevant current event type information. And that's a good place to go to kind of stay up to date. Even if you don't interact with people, even if you don't tweet or, like anything or anything, even if it's just a sock account, just to view the information. I think being on there and following accounts and people that share information like this is a good idea and can help you be an early warning system, right? And the other point I want to make is when you install software, when you update things, particularly when you install software, though, are you checking to make sure that it doesn't introduce vulnerabilities? One of the common things I see on internal pen tests is a software package or a software application will get installed on a Windows endpoint, right? And it'll install a service or a task, or it will install to some other directory other than program files, and there will be a misconfiguration as a result. Right? Maybe there's misconfigured permissions on the directory where it gets installed itself. Or maybe the service gets installed and it gives, everyone the ability to modify the service for some reason, right? Because that's the way the software needs to work. Or maybe there's a scheduled task that gets created and it runs as the system account for some reason for updating purposes. So there's a number of things that can happen when you install the software that, might not be in the documentation and might be a mistake or a vulnerability. So do you check those things when you install the software, when you run updates? Are you kind of checking those endpoints, checking your configurations, more or less just checking what you expect, right? And that's something that is very common that kind of ties into this thread that I want to mention.
Yeah, actually read the patch notes, right?
Yeah.
And also just from a DevSecOps perspective in terms of like our developers, man, you really have to do a deep dive when you introduce libraries into your code. I think, or at least have a process for it, right? And I've talked about this before in terms of like DevSecOps. So often developers, they're just like, I need a library to do this thing. We're not going to write it in house. Git clone.
Yep.
And now you've introduced this library, whatever it is, into your project. Take the extra time, take the due diligence, have a process for really vetting and evaluating the third-party libraries that you introduce into your code.
Yep.
For sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything else to share on this, Darius?
No. I think
Awesome.
we covered it.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed this episode, definitely leave a comment. Let us know what you thought about this. I definitely would like to hear community's feedback and thoughts on this in general. So leave a comment on the YouTube video or on our LinkedIn page, under when we post the episode. And definitely follow us at secureIT360.com and at offsec.blog, where we post a lot of our offensive security blogs and content and podcasts. So follow us there. Lastly, I want to say follow us on LinkedIn as well. If you want to go over to LinkedIn, follow us at secureIT360.com on LinkedIn. We would love to connect with you there. And we release new episodes every Wednesday. So we will see you guys next week.